question of research has had a long and tortuous history in the United States. Defined History, Anti-Intellectualism in American Life by Richard Hofstadter documents how over the years, particularly theoretical ideas, research that was not aimed at a practical outcome was suppressed, even prevented from being discussed in schools. The history, for example, of preventing the study of evolution has that very long history of just by itself. And so we in America have had this struggle between the idea of practical knowledge, applied research, as compared to theoretical research, and very reluctant to support or encourage the latter. Applied research really had a strong place in the development of rural America with farm and home advisors who helped to change the face of much of how farming and living in rural areas was done. For the reason of that tension, when I helped to begin, along with colleagues, the California Institute for Rural Studies, one of the questions was how we would frame our understanding of the use of research. And we framed it in a way that I think was colored by that tortuous history of American view of the role of research. So we tended to emphasize research for action, applied research, things that had a concrete impact on people's lives on a daily basis, not just hypothetically in the future. And the way in which I first came to understand the potential power of using evidence-based applied research to promote organizing happened quite a few years ago. But the notion is a very simple one, and that is to find information directly from people who are affected by a problem, and in a scientific, rigorous, and scientifically valid way, put that together to help others understand this larger question and issue in our society, and bring people together around that issue. Back in the winter of 1958, when my wife and I, or my soon-to-be wife at that point, were students at the University of Chicago, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People student chapter, NAACP, was looking for a white couple to participate with the leaders of that student organization to examine whether or not there was widespread discrimination in the listing of off-campus housing maintained by the university's housing office. The idea was a simple one. That is, a black couple would approach one of the randomly selected addresses in that housing listing and ask of the landlord whether there was availability, because they advertised that there was. And most often, the black students would be turned down. My wife and I, as the volunteers, would come in shortly after and ask the same question. And most of the time, we were offered the opportunity for a rental. And we looked at the offering carefully and decided, well, maybe it was too big, maybe it was too small, maybe it was too expensive, maybe it was too far from the campus. But we said, thank you very much, we're not going to accept the offer. And right after, another black couple would approach the same address and ask the same question. And they too would be turned down, told that it had already been rented. Sam Greenlee, Janice Porter, and the other leaders of the student NAACP did a very careful scientific construction of this examination of the pattern of housing. And they put together a study. It was published in the student newspaper, the Chicago Maroon, and they demanded of the administration that ran the housing office that all landlords who wanted to offer rentals to students be required to sign a non-discrimination agreement, that they would not, as landlords, refuse on the basis of race to make an apartment available. Most of the landlords, of course, would never have done that. And there was a deeper reason, and this was the brilliance of the students and NAACP strategy. At the time, in most white neighborhoods, there were what are called restrictive covenants. These are contracts recorded in the county recorder office that are associated with each property. And the contract basically says that sale or rental of this property to what was then called a Negro person would violate that contract and be the subject of legal action against the landowner. These were widespread, even in the liberal Hyde Park neighborhood of the University of Chicago. The pattern of racial segregation, which in my view is the stain of our legacy of slavery that still hangs over this country, was enforced by contracts in law and always found to be legal under the laws of the state of Illinois at that time. So the students realized that they couldn't attack the restrictive covenants directly because law had said they were okay. And instead, they found a very interesting and brilliant way, I think, to bring that issue to the fore. And because the university declined to enforce this idea of a non-discrimination clause, the students were able to raise the support of other students. They called a press conference for the Chicago newspapers. We picketed the administration building. We had all kinds of other approaches, but it took years, including finally sit-ins by the Black Students Union some years later, to get the university to turn around and finally agree that discrimination in housing or off-campus living by students should be subject to the rules of all persons are created equal in God. When I look back on that, I realized that this was just an amazing example of the creativity of organizers and activists to bring a hidden issue to the fore in a way that could be understood by anyone. And as a result of that, they got support from the student government of the University of Chicago. They got support from fraternities and sororities. They got support from other organizations and were able to build a much larger movement that supported, for example, in the later years, the civil rights movement of the South. I want to now turn to an evidence of how we at the California Institute for Rural Studies were able to use this idea of building on direct measurement of what was going on to build a broader base of support for social change. Back in the 1970s, when the newly enacted California Environmental Quality Act was being implemented, the question came up how to deal with agriculture. Because CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act, required an environmental impact report when there could be a significant adverse impact on the natural environment by all kinds of human interventions. In principle, that would have meant, for example, that whenever a farmer wanted to use pesticides, they would have to go through a whole environmental impact process, which of course would have been extraordinarily cumbersome, expensive, and probably impossible to really carry out. And so they came up with a compromise in figuring out how to implement CEQA, and that was to do a one-time environmental impact statement for all of agriculture. And that meant looking, for example, in each county what pesticides were being used and how they were being used and what the environmental impact might be. At that time, pesticides that were used in California had to be registered with the California Department of Food and Agriculture. And that registration process included a requirement that for the manufacturer to provide information about the efficacy and safety of the product. In other words, whether the stuff actually did what it was supposed to do, which was to kill a pest, essentially, or as well, rather, as whether or not there were health impacts of the use of that material by people who were handling it or who were nearby or happened to live in the neighborhood where that material was being used. As it happened, There were people who were participating in the Institute for Rural Studies and our sister organization, the California Agrarian Action Project, who were hired because they were students in science, the sciences of biology and agriculture at UC Davis, to work on that environmental impact statement. And they produced something called the Environmental Assessment Team Report, or the EAT report, as it came to be known. One of the activists in our organizations came to us and said, I've been looking at the files around the pesticides registered for use in California. And he said, hardly any of them have the required health impact report. The file was empty. It wasn't there, even though the requirement was that it be submitted as a requirement of the registration of the product. And so the question came up, wow, this is really astonishing. You mean they're violating the law, the rules? And we decided, well, how should we approach this? One approach would be you call a press conference, you file a lawsuit, you do all those kinds of things. We decided, no, what we wanted to do was to figure out how to broaden our base and build a much stronger movement. And the way we did it was to not disclose something that had been told to us in confidence anyway, but instead start a statewide petition campaign to open up the files. Why is it that a doctor couldn't see what was in those files? The manufacturer said, well, it's a trade secret. We spent all this money doing the health study, therefore we would be giving away, so to speak, a trade secret if that were available. People who lived in communities being affected adversely, as they viewed it, by pesticides being sprayed nearby, also could not get access to those files. Lawsuits had actually been filed by CRLA to try to get access to files in which workers had been injured by applications of pesticides where they were working. In all cases, the California Department of Food and Agriculture blocked even access to the files. We thought, here was the issue. So the petition campaign turned out to be quite remarkable. For example, up in Humboldt County, people living in rural areas where herbicides were being used by the U.S. Forest Service regularly. And that material was being sprayed in the forests and collecting in the rainfall and going into the creeks and rivers. And there were concerns by fishermen, there were concerns by native peoples, there were concerns as well, of course, by the residents of that area. People in urban areas were concerned about pesticides in their food. There had been an incident on a July 4th day back in those days that I remember very clearly where it was found that watermelon had been contaminated by a pesticide. It was actually dangerous to eat. And so people wanted to know what was in their food. So the movement became quite broad. And ultimately became so broad that it included urban residents. And so we ended up with a very broad movement. It became part of California Pesticides and Toxics Coalition, later known simply as the Californians for Toxic Reform. Demonstrations in the Capitol brought 20,000 people. We had broadcasts on radio that said things like, when you hear that airplane flying near your house early in the morning and look out and you see a cloud of stuff falling down, wouldn't you like to know what that is? Open up the books, open up the files. Eventually, because of tragic events that were happening in some communities, in McFarland in particular, where a number of children became so ill with cancer, and a few died, the concern was so great that people felt it's really time to fix this. And so a bill was introduced in the state legislature and passed, called the Birth Defects Prevention Act. And we even got the support of the ag interests when activists from McFarland came to the hearings and stared directly at Roseanne Buttigieg, chairing the ag committee, and said, our children are dying, what can you do to help us? We got that law. So instead of taking the simple path of disclosing that the files were empty, which could have had an effect, we found a way to build and contribute to a stronger movement that ultimately passed Proposition 65, which embeds in California law the right of everyone to know. Everyone has that right to know.